Despite a popular belief, the early history of theaters wasn't as well recorded as we thought. Well, at least for the technical theater side of things. Throughout the years, you hear so much about the different directing and acting styles, but never as much about how the technology of the theater has changed and how rapidly it has changed. Today, we're going to go through this history from ancient Rome and Greece to the more modern incandescent lights. We're also going to talk about two people in particular who helped make lighting design closer to what we expect today, with all the creativity and experimentation you come to expect, rather than the naturalism and realism we used to have. So, there's no better place to start than the beginning. The first theatrical shows in ancient Rome and Greece were often outdoors with roofless theaters and the sun as their light source. This type of light system with roofless theaters was especially popular in Rome, where shows were often performed in the morning or afternoon to make use of the daylight as much as possible. While the sun was a useful tool, the late Romans would also use lamps, candles, and torches that would remain unaltered until around 1784, when controlling a uniform flow of air was introduced. From what we can tell, surviving Greek and Roman lamps resembled the shallow clay teapots with one or more spouts used to support wick channels. However, these did produce less light than candles. Increased wick thickness could produce more light, but as a result, it would produce more smoke. Candles and lamps were two of the three main categories of domestic lights used until early modern London. The last category is considered more of a miscellaneous category, which includes flashlights, torches, lamps, and tapers. Flashlights were considered the most inexpensive since they were thin piths of soft rushes dipped in kitchen grease and were often supported by wire rush holders. Because of this, they were also used frequently as nightlights in bedrooms. Torches were about 3 to 4 times more expensive to produce than lamps, which were usually several lengths of hemp rope bound together around a wooden staff. Due to them being so expensive, torches were often used indoors for the very wealthy. Lanterns were another light source that theaters around this time would use. They were mostly for outdoor use and were candles placed in a wooden or metal box with windows of oiled paper, parchment, or horn. So as you could tell, these really haven't changed much from what we see in the modern day. Tapers were single thin ropes dipped in wax or tallow that smoked and stank, but required little snuffing, so they were often used as nightlights. But were weaker than rushlights. As you could tell, a lot of the lights used during the Restoration era was often used as well for home lights, and this practice was actually quite common. Candles back then were the most popular at the time, and haven't changed much compared to their modern-day counterparts. Their wicks were made of a cotton or flax strands twisted together. However, these candles would often burn unevenly and didn't bend into the flame and consume themselves like more modern candles, so they would often have to be guttered or snuffed to prevent this. However, the most common fuel at the time was tallow, or purified rendered meat fat, usually from sheep or oxen, or the more expensive but better option, beeswax, often used in churches due to beeswax being brighter and odorless. We all like a bright church, am I right? After the Restoration, fuel was refined, allowing people to get rid of the drip pans also found under the candles to make sure that wax wasn't wasted. Eventually, theaters would move more towards oil lamps that provided brighter flames but more smoke at first, until in 1783, M. Ledgers developed a flat, woven, ribbon-like wick, securing it to a closed-fitting support. For those lamps, whale oil was the most common type of fuel used, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries, until coal became a more reliable option. After Ledger's flat wick, Ami and Gard developed a burner which consisted of a tubular wick attached to a tube that extended through the oil reservoir and opened in the base of the lamp, according to a history of stage lighting in the United States in the 19th century, by McDonald, Watkins, Held. While these improvements helped exponentially in making theaters both safer and more appealing to audiences, it wasn't until the use of gas burners that things really took a turn for the better. Once gas lamps became more accessible, people began to use them more due to their being brighter and cheaper to produce. This also, in turn, made theaters safer, with there being less of an open flame hitting just the right spot in a theater. The original gas burners were open flames coming from an orifice. The earliest improvements to this design were burners which had two orifices that were inclined towards each other at a 90-degree angle, so the gas would escape through the opening. The two currents would merge into a broad sheet, which gave them the name of flat flame burners. We also have batwing burners, which operated the same way mostly, but with a narrow slit across the top. These lamps caused better combustion, which created better and brighter light. As audience members became more and more used to greater illumination of the stage provided by gas, there was a trend of brighter lights, making them more and more common in theaters. Border lights eventually began appearing more as a result, and foot and strip lights were modified to adapt to these changes. This is why you saw a lot of front acting during this time. It wasn't only for getting closer to the audience, but it was also to make sure that we could see the actors better, which is why aprons were often be very wide. However, with more and more flames being introduced, more and more fires inside theaters came as a result. While theater fires were common, they were often rebuilt quickly and were due to flimsy building structures. From 1799 to 1874, Philadelphia would lose 17 theaters to fire. New York would lose 26 theaters to fire between the years 1820 and 1873, and Chicago would lose 12 between 1851 and 1877. This would be a common trend, where there being a total of 176 theater fires of the United States alone during the year of 1880. One of the worst fires during this time was the Richmond Theater Fire in Virginia in 1811. On December 27th, a benefit for M. Posade was being given in the theater, resulting in the auditorium being packed. During a quick scene change, one of the stagehands became impatient and placed a lamp near a flammable object without extinguishing the flame, causing the theater to catch on fire. This resulted in 71 people being burned or crushed to death. To help make sure tragedies like that didn't happen, theaters began making changes to auditoriums to be better equipped for gas lamps. For example, in 1880, Madison Square Theater placed all its lights behind glass and provided separate ventilation for each lamp. These would cause the heat from the lamps to draw away and prevent contamination of the air. For its time, it was considered the most perfectly ventilated public building in the world. In 1879, Edison successfully attained light with electricity through incandescence, making safer and brighter lights more possible and expecting an expediting process in the more modern lights we see today. Gas will continue to be used regularly for the next decade until electricity power provided to have greater illumination. We recorded way more about filament lights and incandescent lamps, so this section might be a bit longer than the rest. Bear with me. With Edison's filament light bulb, incandescent lights became the new normal with the most amount of changes and the most detailed history. These lights were revolutionary for their time, making lights much safer, basically eliminating the fire hazards that gas had, and it became easier to control with the help of dimmers and switchboards. Switchboards were also immediately adapted to the face of lighting boards, making them organized and more useful, eventually turning to look more like the modern light boards we see today. Dimmers, which are still widely used today, are electrical devices that, when connected, can help people control stage lights from remote location. There were two methods of controlling the flow of electricity: mechanical and electronic. Mechanical dimmers required physical manipulation of an axle running through the core of the dimmer to adjust the current's flow. Electronic dimmers, however, used low-voltage control systems to adjust the current flow in the high-voltage load circuit, similar to how they operate today. As dimmers and switchboards improved, so did the incandescent lamps and many of the lights around them. Border lights and footlights didn't change too much from their gas counterparts, but floor pockets began to be developed that carried 4 circuits for said lights. Colored media was also becoming more and more common. These were colored lights obtained with colored gauze, calico, silk, and other fabrics. So you can see when we started experimenting more with color, right? While early lamps could not be used for long periods due to oxidation of the filament from extreme heat, Edison would make a lamp that had a carbonized thread as a filament and would make lamps last for 40 hours. In 1881, people would switch to charred bamboo as filament. In 1888, they would again switch to a lather-coated asphalt, which improved the lamp's efficiency. However, these lights didn't come without their own set of problems. Early improvements were made, but by the end of the century, the present type of screw base hadn't been developed. We also had the issue of figuring how to introduce the lamps to the electrical circuits, but as you heard earlier, they did find some workarounds and ways to improve it. Slowly but surely, electric lights became the new normal, which gas companies hated, but who didn't expect that to happen? Candle makers were the same way with gas. The first electrical installation was in Salt Lake Theater, which used its 12 lamps for the first time in September 11, 1880, thanks to the railway company. The first completed installation was at the Beaujeu Theater in Boston in 1882, and the first recorded theater in the country to be lighted with the power from its central station was reported in Brockton, Massachusetts in 1884. Later that fall, 6 more theaters in New York would convert to electrical installations, with the People's Theater being the first playhouse in New York to introduce electrical lighting. While the lights themselves would go through a number of changes to appear closer to the more modern incandescent lights, how they were being used for shows was changing as well. Designers like Adophe, Appia, and Edward Wharton Craig would be the biggest members in changing how shows were lit and helped create new ways of improving light, more than just the technical level. Appia's Die Musik und die Eisenberg was one of his more influential works, criticizing the aesthetics of Richard Wagner's operas and how he staged them, saying that it seemed artificial and pretentious, while continuing to advocate for a breakaway from realism. He refined his style, which he called rhythmic spaces, since they would contain lots of vertical and horizontal lines. He would also classify lights into 3 categories: painted, general, and creative or formative light. Painted light was 2-dimensional paintings imitating the light, which Appia especially hated. General light is exactly as it sounds. Think of it as a general wash on a stage. Creative light, however, wasn't really seen since the technology hadn't become a thing yet, since lights couldn't really move at that point. It's directional, concentrated light beams highlighting performance in other 3-dimensional objects, while also casting shadows and creating contrast between light, shade, and the background. So to put it simply, think of every creative thing a lighting designer has done, and that hasn't just been a general wash, and throw it into that category. Craig would go on to do similar research and find ways to overhaul realism. Throughout his career, Craig would explore traditions of ancient Greek and Japanese theater, growing quite fond of their use of masks and puppets. His Uber marionette was a result of that. Uber marionette, which honestly really no one knows how to explain, but Craig phrased it as using light to experiment with the geometry of the human figure in 3-dimensional spaces, especially with his system of mobile stretched canvases with wooden frames. He was also very well known for his experimentation with lighting effects and often used colored slides and patterned illumination, shadows of plants in front of lamp lenses, lighting through semi-transparent curtains, etc. Gee, kinda reminds you of some more modern small discs with shapes cut into them in transparent colored gels, right? Due to these experiments, his looks often changed how performers appeared based on their emotions as the characters, according to dramatic situations. If that doesn't make sense, let's use an example. In Dio and Aeneas, just directed by no other than Craig himself, in the last scene, without spoilers, Craig used a lot of strong light from above to cast long shadows beneath one of the character's eyebrows, nose, and chin, causing said actress's face to appear distorted because of its unnatural angles. A lot of these techniques that these two used have been further refined to what we see closer to today. Both designers loved playing with lights, especially when it came to the geometry of the space and angles. What they've done to help develop shows to look more like they do now cannot be understated. Past the more modern incandescent lights, resources to help learn about how they were created and design techniques for those new lights are far easier to find than they were previously. While I would have loved to touch more on some of the finer details like torches and tapirs, we just don't have the time. I could spend ages telling everyone how cool this stuff is, especially with how its more modern technologies and equipment have evolved. If you want to do more research on any of these topics, the sources I used and all the other important information can be found in the description. And I hope this adds to people's understandings of the more technical side of lighting and its history, especially how electricity made things progress much faster and made theaters much safer, so we can enjoy the shows we love without worrying if a candle is going to set a theater on fire. If you want to add more to this discussion and offer your thoughts, feel free to let them rip in the comments. Respectfully. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed learning how we stop burning theaters down as fast as we used to. Until next time, take care and have a wonderful day.